vote yes for cloture on this important bill so that we can pass it out of the Senate today, get it over to the House as quickly as we can and to the President's desk for signature. And I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings in the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I also ask for unanimous consent to speak for 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, we're going to have a vote a little bit later this afternoon to proceed to a bill which I don't happen to think is a very good bill, but I'm going to vote to proceed to it because the majority leader has made clear that we will have the opportunity to offer amendments. And I know that some of my colleagues specifically would like to offer amendments to get to the heart of the subject that should be most on our minds today, which is reducing wasteful Washington spending, to get our fiscal house in order. And in order to provide that opportunity, we should, in my view, proceed to that legislation so that we can offer those amendments. We should be laser-like focused on the deficit, the debt, the spending of the United States Congress, and what we can do to get a handle on that spending so that we do not mortgage our children's future. It starts, of course, with a budget. Just a few weeks ago, the President submitted his budget to Congress, but it seems to me that the message that that budget sends is one of more spending, a bigger government, and one that trumps Americans' well-founded concerns about this huge debt that we're piling up and how it jeopardizes our nation's future. Under this budget, the debt held by the public will double by the end of this President's term in 2012, and then triple by 2019 to an astonishing $7.3 billion. Now think about that for a moment. In all of our history, from 1789, from George Washington through George W. Bush, we accumulated roughly $5 billion of debt. This President's budget in his first term will double that. So in just the term of President Obama, we will accumulate as much debt as every president of the United States combined before that. That's too much. And it will triple in the next 5 years. That's what we're talking about on this, with regard to this budget. The debt is actually going to be larger than our entire economy. And think of the attendant consequences of that. It not only undermines confidence in our economy, but it crushes private sector investment and therefore job creation. This budget punts on everything serious that we need to do to bring down the debt. It accelerates our path to national bankruptcy. It ignores all the major components of the President's Debt Commission's deficit financing or reduction plan. And it punts on serious spending cuts and punts on entitlement reform. In fact, the Washington Post editorialized the day after the budget was submitted, calling the President the punter-in-chief. It's a failure of leadership, and it indicates to me that the President is not taking the debt problem seriously. As Erskine Bowles, who was the Democratic chairman of the President's Fiscal Commission, said, the White House budget request, and I'm quoting now, goes nowhere near where they will need to have to go to resolve our fiscal nightmare, end of quotation. We cannot spend, borrow, and tax our way to prosperity. Unfortunately, that's what the budget request proposes to do. Let me just review a few key facts and some of the numbers in the budget. Under the category of it spends too much, the size of the federal government will nearly double since the day President Obama took office. Let me say that again. Under the President's budget, the size of the federal government will nearly double since the day he took office. Now, you can't claim with a straight face that that represents anything close to fiscal discipline. Over the next 10 years, the President proposes $8.7 trillion in new spending in this budget, with $46 trillion in total spending. Spending in the 2012 fiscal year is projected to be a record $3.8 trillion, or 25.3% of the gross domestic product, which is the highest spending ratio to GDP since World War II. I'll note that while the President has touted the 5-year $400 billion in spending freezes in his budget, those freezes merely lock in spending levels reached after the massive spending binge that occurred on his watch. And in my view, the status quo is not good enough. It's like closing the door to the barn after the horse is already gone. The President says his spending would cut $1.1 trillion over the coming decade, and yes, that's true, but that's from what he planned to spend. So if he made an extraordinarily irresponsible request for spending and then cuts it by $1 trillion, it's not something to be cheering about. The figure is smaller than the projected $1.5 trillion deficit just for the year 2011 alone. We need to do, and we can do, much better. Under the category, it borrows too much. The budget adds $13 trillion in new debt by the end of the decade. Gross debt by the end of the decade will reach $26.3 trillion, or 107% of gross domestic product, and that figure eclipses the size of the entire economy. Gross debt is projected to remain above 100% of GDP for every following year. The effects of high debt on an economy are well known. It includes fewer jobs, less investing, and a lower standard of living, and that's not acceptable. Under the category of taxes too much, in total, the President's budget includes $1.6 trillion in new taxes on families, small businesses, and job creators. Much of that is new taxes on energy, including on the gasoline we buy, and new taxes on Obamacare, the health care reform. In fact, the President's health care bill is mentioned more than 250 times in the IRS's fiscal year 2012 budget request. The IRS has said it will have to hire thousands of new workers just to implement the new taxes in the health care law. Let's remember, we're not in our current predicament because we're an undertaxed nation. It's because of wasteful Washington spending. I'm deeply disappointed the administration has not put together a more responsible and serious budget proposal. I had hoped that the White House had received the message that Americans sent in the last election about spending and debt and the size of our government. It's time for us to make tough choices. We need to focus on pro-growth policies, which include much lower levels of spending and borrowing, and leaving more money in the private sector where it can be put to good use, including job creation. Republicans want to work with the President to seriously cut government spending and bring down the debt. House Republicans took the first step by putting together a proposal that will cut spending to 2008 levels. That's the levels prior to the Obama-era spending binge, a binge which included, among other things, the failed stimulus plan and other massive spending bills. That's the kind of meaningful action that we need. And I ask the President, lead, work with our leaders on both sides of the aisle to do a better job of promoting prosperity through much more sensible fiscal policies. As I said, my colleagues will have amendments that they will be bringing to the floor this week in an effort to point in the right direction. Another thing that is of concern to Americans and that we ought to be doing something about here at the federal government level is the problem of energy production and the implications of that through things such as higher gas prices. Notably, the Energy Department recently estimated that the average American household can expect to spend $700 more at the gas pump this year than it did in 2010. In fact, since President Obama came into office, our gasoline prices have doubled. In a tight oil market, new domestic supply can have a very positive impact on gasoline prices, and developing that supply would create many well-paying American jobs. So what I'd like to suggest today is that we should have a national policy in support of affordable new domestic energy. This is an opportunity for government to set the stage for job creation in the private sector rather than continue its attempts to create jobs through its own costly government legislation. Although we import 63% of our oil, America actually has abundant supplies of both oil and natural gas right here at home. In a Washington Post op-ed published in 2008, columnist Robert Samuelson wrote, and I'm quoting, that it may surprise Americans to discover that the United States is the third largest oil producer behind Saudi Arabia and Russia, the third largest oil producer. We could be producing a lot more, but Congress and the administration have put large areas of potential supply off limits. They include the Atlantic and Pacific coasts and parts of Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico. So why haven't these energy development projects moved forward? Let me provide some background. Before leaving office, President George W. Bush lifted an executive moratorium that had previously barred oil and natural gas development in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico, and Congress subsequently rescinded a statutory moratorium that year. These actions were intended to open an estimated 5.8 million acres in the central Gulf to oil leasing and to make as much as 16 billion barrels of oil available. However, after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf in 2010, the Obama administration imposed a new moratorium that all but halted deepwater exploration and development in the area. A number of investigations were conducted to determine the cause of the Deepwater Horizon accident and protect against similar incidents in the future, and that was very appropriate. But it was neither necessary nor wise to halt all offshore energy exploration and development in response to the spill. The country needs a reliable supply of oil to fuel our cars, homes, and power plants, not to mention satisfy the numerous manufacturing processes that rely on oil. Locking away the vast supply of oil in the deep waters of the Gulf merely increased our nation's vulnerability to the oil shocks emanating from abroad and put customers at a risk of higher gasoline prices. Despite federal court orders, it was not until the end of February 2011 that the Interior Department finally issued the first permit to allow the resumption of energy exploration and development. Unfortunately, that permit was for just a single project. Essentially, the moratorium has become a permitatorium, or an extreme slowdown of drilling permits allocated by this administration. This slowdown has included delays, suspensions, revocations, and cancellations of lease permits. These moratoriums have caused 6 deepwater rigs to depart the Gulf for other countries, taking valuable jobs, revenue, and income with them. Others may soon leave as well. Former President Bill Clinton understands the damaging impact these de facto moratoriums have on our economy. Last Friday, he called the continued delays ridiculous. Just as we should reopen the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico to prudent exploration and development, so too should we lift the moratorium that's preventing job-creating development of resource-rich areas such as Alaska's outer continental shelf, as well as oil shale in various western states. Senator Murkowski has pointed out that her state of Alaska has estimated oil reserves in excess of 65 years' worth of Persian Gulf oil imports, yet they're virtually off limits. And as Alaska's Governor Sean Parnell wrote in a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, and I'm quoting, "If Americans wonder what our economic Achilles heel is, they need look no further than the federal regulatory system that delays permits for domestic exploration and production," end of quote. The federal government estimates that Alaska's outer continental shelf holds 27 billion barrels of oil and 132 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. We could be drilling now in the Arctic Ocean off the coast of Alaska if the Environmental Protection Agency would speed things up and issue an air permit. Developing these resources would not only generate vast new supplies, but translate to a lot of good jobs. In fact, a new study by the Northern Economics and University of Alaska Anchorage's Institute of Social and Economic Research shows that developing oil and gas in the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas of Alaska's outer continental shelf would create 54,700 new jobs that would be sustained for 50 years. An estimated $63 billion would be paid to employees in Alaska, and another $82 billion would be paid to employees in the rest of the United States. As the report notes, and I quote, "Domestic energy production is important for the security and prosperity of the United States. The money spent on domestic energy cycles through the U.S. economy thereby increasing domestic economic activity and jobs, end of quote. Another resource-rich area in Alaska is ANWR. Despite being one of the largest producers, or resources rather, of oil and gas in the U.S., Alaska's ANWR is off limits for energy development. Tapping oil and gas supplies in ANWR would require opening up just 2,000 acres of the 19 million acre Arctic plain to such development. And remember, ANWR was, by Congress, specifically set aside for oil and gas exploration and development. It was specifically created for that purpose. This 2,000 acres would be the equivalent of the airport in Phoenix, which is called Phoenix Sky Harbor, inside an area the size of South Carolina. Hardly noticeable. Using directional drilling with a small environmental footprint, at least 1 million barrels of oil a day could be obtained from just this one area, this 2,000 acres, one area for the next 20 years. The U.S. Geological Survey has estimated that the area could have up to 16 billion barrels of recoverable oil, an amount that's equivalent to 30 years of Saudi oil imports. And analysis from the Arctic Power shows that opening up ANWR to oil and gas production would create approximately 730,000 jobs. Those opposed to developing these resources often make the argument that it will take 10 years to open ANWR. But if President Clinton had not vetoed legislation authorizing Arctic development in 1995, oil would likely be flowing from the area today, easing prices and helping to insulate our economy from the whims of OPEC. Continued delay will only put our nation further at risk. A few final points about abundant onshore oil shale resources, permits for which have also been blocked by the administration. In 2009, the administration canceled 77 oil and gas leases in Utah, and in 2010 canceled another 61 in Montana. It's been estimated that the United States has approximately 800 billion barrels of technically recoverable shale oil, which is roughly 3 times more than the proven reserves of Saudi Arabia. 3 times more than the proven reserves of Saudi Arabia. Again, it's all off limits. Finally, a note about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. In recent days, some of my colleagues have called for tapping into America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve to bring down gas prices. But this Strategic Petroleum Reserve is a national security tool to guard against an economically threatening disruption in oil supplies. It was never intended to be used to lower gas prices. Our problem today is not a matter of supply. We have plenty of supply. Since its creation in 1995, a presidentially directed release from SPRO has occurred only twice. In 1991 at the beginning of Operation Desert Storm, and in September 2005 after the devastation Hurricane Katrina caused in the Gulf of Mexico. The current SPRO inventory is 724 million barrels, which equates to about 34 days of oil at current daily U.S. consumption. Tapping the reserve is nothing more than a short-term political solution to a problem largely of the administration's own making, its continued refusal to allow access to our nation's plentiful resources. Mr. President, the benefits of increasing domestic energy production are unquestionable, especially at a time when gas prices are soaring and good jobs are needed by many, many Americans. I urge the administration to move swiftly in favor of issuing more production permits and urge my Senate colleagues to support policies in favor of increased domestic energy production. There is no reason for further delay. And I would note that one of the most eloquent spokesmen for this same point is on the floor, the senator from Louisiana, and I'd be happy to yield to her.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to follow the remarks of the senator from Arizona and associate myself with part of his remarks that have to do with the energy policy of our country today. I am, as he is, disappointed in the administration's reluctance to get the Gulf of Mexico back up to work. We did have a terrible tragedy in April, it'll be almost a year, April 20th, the Deep Horizon catastrophe. But I would like to note, Mr. President, that for 40 years or longer, and 40,000 wells have been drilled safely in the Gulf, in the shallow water and in the deep water, since 1940. Deep water coming into play in about 1985. And up until the Deepwater Horizon accident, this industry had acted responsibly, in large measure with cutting-edge technologies. Yes, we have to continue to investigate what happened, but, Mr. President, shutting down so much of our domestic drilling with the unrest in other parts of the world is just, I think, not the right policy. And I want to associate myself with the remarks of the Senator on the energy piece, as well as tapping into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This is not a crisis of supply. It's not a crisis of pricing. It's a crisis of supply. I'm sorry, it's not a crisis of supply. It's a crisis of pricing, and that SPRO should only be tapped when there's a supply issue, and we can get back to drilling more at home and be efficient in other places. But what I really would like to talk about just briefly, and I know Senator Durbin's coming to the floor, is just to give my heartfelt condolences to the people of Japan, Mr. President. We've watched all weekend, my husband and my family and I, in horror, watching the scene unfold with the terrible catastrophe that struck Japan on Friday afternoon, followed the earthquake 9.0 now on the Richter scale, followed by a terrible tsunami, a wave of water, in some places 30 feet high, that devastated coastal communities. Some of the pictures are reminiscent of what happened to us on the Gulf Coast about 5.5 years ago, with a 30-foot wave coming on shore right into Gulfport in Biloxi, Mississippi, and then a catastrophe of man-made proportions, in our case, when the federal levee system broke and 1,800 people lost their lives. But this situation in Japan, as we now know from watching, is the worst crisis, according to their prime minister, since the Second World War. It's going to take all of our best efforts, governments around the world, individuals, corporations, and businesses, to be generous. I know and I hope the people of Louisiana and our cities and communities will be generous, because we were so benefited by the warm generosity of the people of Japan and many, many volunteers that came from all over the country and the world. I hope that as this week of just search and rescue comes to a close, that then there'll be time for debris cleanup and rebuilding and mental health counseling and all the things that have to go into helping an area of the country survive and grow back. And I know the people of Japan were as prepared as any country could be for a situation like this, but the events of that day have even overwhelmed one of the best and most organized governments in the world. And I just am heartbroken to hear the thousands of people that are yet unaccounted for, and our hearts go out to them. I hope that our nation will be generous in this time, not only from just a charitable and moral standpoint, but, Mr. President, Japan is one of the strongest economies in the world. From the state that I represent, Louisiana, we are their second largest trading partner as a state. So for the people of Louisiana and all of our states have a vested interest in Japan getting back up on its feet, building better and stronger. We're still in the process of rebuilding New Orleans and the lower Ninth Ward and New Orleans East and other neighborhoods that were hard hit along the Gulf Coast. Gulfport and Waveland are still struggling to come back. An important economic center for our country, but most certainly this coastal and industrial community around Sendai and other coastal communities are very important, not just to Japan, but to the world. So I hope with this 9.0 earthquake that hit, I hope people know that this is 1,000 times worse than an 8-point on the Richter scale. It's just not slightly worse. It's 1,000 times worse. This was worse. It's a huge earthquake and shift in the earth plates, and then the subsequent tsunami. So on behalf of the people of Louisiana, we want to say a special condolences and best wishes for the people of Japan as they recover and bury their dead, those that have lost, and heal their injured and begin to rebuild their cities and communities even stronger than they were before. And I hope that we'll all be as generous as we can. And one final point, Mr. President, this is a wake-up call to our country, and as Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, I'd like to get this on record this week. This is a wake-up call because we have not funded adequately our disaster response fund, the DERF. We are actually about $1.6 billion below where we should be. This is not a wise policy, given what happened over the weekend. Catastrophes can strike without warning at any time. If we leave just the amount of money that's in the DERF and something like a Katrina or this event would happen, that money would be used up in 3 days. And we have not replenished that fund. I've called on the President to send a supplemental emergency bill. We can't pay for current disasters out of future preparedness money, and that's what the continuing resolution in the House basically does. I strongly object to taking money that we have to set aside in the event that catastrophes happen to pay for past disasters. So that's another reason that I voted against the House concurrent resolution, and now with this visual of this horrific tragedy unfolding in Japan with the tsunami, the destruction of the cities, the 2 nuclear power plants that are under extraordinary pressure, it does us no good to take money out of paying for current disasters, paying for the past damage. So I've sent a letter to the President asking him to send up an emergency bill. It would be wise for us to pay for past emergencies off budget and then to use our Homeland Security bill to budget as effectively and as appropriately as we can for disasters that may occur. I'm proud to say that the Democratic leadership has doubled the amount of money that we're setting aside just in case these things happen. It used to be only $800 million a year. Now we're budgeting close to 1.8 or 1.9, thinking that in the event that something happens, we want to make sure. This is in 48 states. Disasters have been declared in the last 2 years, not just along the Gulf Coast. We've had flooding up in the Northeast. We've had flooding in the Midwest. We could potentially have, we had some flooding this weekend. I'm not sure how widespread it was, but in New Jersey there were scenes throughout the weekend about rivers overflowing as the spring approaches. So, Mr. President, let us, as we mourn for Japan and are in solidarity with them through this crisis, let's use this as a reminder to get our business straight, to get our budget straight, and not, mess around with our disaster relief fund. Let's pay for past disasters that we owe the communities we've pledged to help them rebuild, and set aside the appropriate money in the regular budget to take care of things that might happen this year as we advance. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Senator from Arizona.
I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum clause be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to proceed in morning business for 20 minutes instead of the 10.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I ask that after my opening statement that my colleague from Connecticut be allowed to give his statement, and then I ask unanimous consent that the senator from Connecticut and I be allowed to engage in a colloquy. And I understand that the senator from Connecticut may be using his 10 minutes. Is that correct?
Without objection.
I thank you, Mr. President. Today, my colleague, Senator Lieberman, and I introducing a resolution on the situation in Libya. Mr. President, is it allowed to send to the desk a resolution, even though we're in morning business, and its consideration be delayed until the appropriate time?
The resolution will be received and appropriately referred.
On behalf of myself and Senator Lieberman, I send the resolution to the desk. Mr. President, the wording of the resolution is sense of the Senate. It is pretty simple and straightforward. It calls for a recognition of the provisional revolutionary government in Libya, and it calls for the in placing as rapidly as possible a no-fly zone over Libya. It has some other language associated with it, which I would go into later on. But the fact is that what it does is urges the President of the United States to take long overdue action to prevent the massacres that are taking place in Libya as we speak. At this moment, opponents of Colonel Gaddafi and his supporters are fighting for their very survival. The demands of the Libyan people began much like those of their neighbors in North Africa and the Middle East for the protection of their universal rights, for greater political freedom and representative government, for justice and opportunity. But the response of Gaddafi and those still loyal to him stands in stark contrast to the inspiring events of what some are calling the Arab Spring. Gaddafi has unleashed a merciless campaign of violence against the Libyan people, including civilian non-combatants, using every tool at his disposal, from artillery barrages to airstrikes to the employment of foreign mercenaries. As President Bill Clinton correctly stated last week, and I quote, "It's not a fair fight. It's not a fair fight." And now the hour is growing dark. Over the past week, the momentum has increasingly shifted away from the opposition and toward Gaddafi, showing once again what a lot of us understand about warfare, that a smaller, well-trained, well-equipped force can usually prevail over a larger, less trained and less equipped force. One by one, towns that had been liberated by the opposition are now falling to Gaddafi's forces. We're only now beginning to learn the savage cost of those losses, especially on the civilian population, the women, children, and elderly who could neither fight nor flee Gaddafi's rampage. And, of course, those brave Libyan rebels who many suspected of aiding their cause, who face certain death, or perhaps a fate worse than death. We're horrified by what we have learned already, but what we have yet to learn, and what we could still witness if Gaddafi's forces are allowed to finish this unfair fight, will shock and offend the conscience of the entire world. Last week, in a hearing in the Committee on Armed Services, the Director of National Intelligence said that absent outside assistance to the opposition, quote, "I think over the long term that the Gaddafi regime will prevail, and yet it is the policy of the United States, as stated by the President, and I quote, Gaddafi must step down from power and leave. That's the right policy. But it is increasingly at odds now with the facts on the ground. So we face a stark choice. Either the President and the United States takes greater action to achieve the objectives he has laid out, or we allow events to play out as they are, meaning that Gaddafi reclaims control of his country. The resolution that Senator Lieberman and I are introducing calls on the President to take a number of steps immediately to reverse this impending disaster. First, the President should recognize Libya's Transitional National Council, which is based in Benghazi, but representative of communities across the country, as the sole legitimate governing authority of Libya, just as the government of France has done. President Sarkozy and the French have recognized the sole legitimate government in Libya as the provisional government which is based in Benghazi. Some continue to say we don't know who the opposition is and thus we can't assist them. That's ridiculous. They've been organized for weeks. Their senior leaders consist of longstanding critics of Gaddafi as well as officials who recently broke with his regime. They even have a website, and they are asking, they are pleading for international support. Gaddafi has forfeited the right to power through his vicious actions. We must recognize the opposition government. Second, the President should take immediate steps to implement a no-fly zone in Libya with international support. Not only has the Libyan opposition government called for this, the Gulf Cooperation Council has called a no-fly zone. The head of the Organization of the Islamic Conference has called for a no-fly zone, and on Saturday, the Arab League called for a no-fly zone. The French and British governments have voiced their support and have drafted a UN Security Council resolution to implement a no-fly zone. It is long past time for the President of the United States to answer these calls for international leadership. The United States of America must lead. A no-fly zone was never going to be the decisive action that tipped the balance against Gaddafi, even when Senator Lieberman and I called for it nearly 3 weeks ago. But it remains the case that a no-fly zone would take one of Gaddafi's most lethal tools off the table and thereby boost the confidence of Libya's opposition. It is Libyans themselves who want to do the fighting against Gaddafi, but they want it to be a fair fight, and so should we. Finally, the President should develop and implement a comprehensive strategy to accomplish the stated U.S. objective of Gaddafi leaving power. Beyond a no-fly zone and beyond these actions like sanctions and humanitarian assistance that we are already taking, there are many actions that we could consider, from sharing intelligence on Gaddafi's forces with opposition, to providing them with support for command and control, to technical assistance and even forms of security assistance if they request it. We could jam Gaddafi's communications and his television, and if we can provide it in a responsible way. Our window of opportunity to support the Libyan people is closing quickly, and this country has a choice to make. Are we going to take action to support the people of Libya in their fight for freedom? Or are we going to stand by, doing more than nothing but less than enough, to achieve our stated goal of Gaddafi leaving power? We all say that we support the universal rights of the Arabs and Muslims in countries across the Middle East and North Africa who are inspiring us all in their quest for greater freedom, opportunity, and justice. But Libya is the real test. It's a test of whether we will provide our support not just when it's easy, but when it's difficult. And it requires more of us than just speeches and expressions of solidarity. If Gaddafi is allowed to prevail in Libya and crush his opponents, it will send a signal throughout the region that force is the way to respond to peaceful demands for a better life. And it will cause all of our expressions of support for the universal rights of all people to ring far more hollow. Before I yield to my friend from Connecticut, I would just like to point out, now we have former President Clinton, we have the Arab League, we have the French, the British, other nations throughout the world, and organizations in the region and without that are saying crying out that we need to help these people. And when President Obama says the noose is tightening around Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, in fact, it's tightening around the Libyan rebels. And the way he is doing it and what he is doing to his own people are crimes against humanity. It's time that we stood up. It's time we read from the New York Times this morning by Anne-Marie Slaughter entitled "Fiddling While Libya Burns." It's time we read again on Saturday the Wall Street Journal lead editorial entitled "The Obama Doctrine. Libya is what a world without U.S. leadership looks like." Quote, "This is the Obama conception of the U.S. role in the world, to work through multilateral organizations and bilateral relationships to make sure that the steps we are taking are amplified." That was by National Security Council spokesman Ben Rhodes, as quoted in the Washington Post. "They bombed us with tanks, airplanes, missiles coming from every direction. We need international support, at least a no-fly zone. Why is the world not supporting us?" That's from Libyan rebel Mohammed Abdel Hamid on March 10th, as quoted in the Wall Street Journal. These people are crying out for help. They are fighting for freedom. They are fighting an unequal situation on the battlefield. The least we can do, the very least we can do, is recognize them in their struggle for freedom and give them some assistance. Otherwise, as the President's National Security Advisor stated on Friday, Gaddafi will prevail. That will send a signal throughout the world that we'll have Tiananmen squares in this world, not Tahrir squares. I yield to my colleague from Connecticut.
Mr. President,
The senator from Connecticut.
I thank the chair. I thank my friend and colleague from Arizona. It's my honor to join with him in submitting this resolution. I hope in time we will gather the support of members on both sides of the political aisle, and that we will make a statement, an urgent statement, that the members of the United States Senate are ready across party lines to take a stand here, because we understand that we are at a turning point in history, and we can't stand back and hope it goes in the right direction. In fact, today, as we watch events unfolding in Libya, I think we have reason to believe it's going in exactly the wrong direction. Mr. President, let me read the first two paragraphs of this resolution that Senator McCain and I have introduced today, because I think it sets what's happening in Libya in a context and also explains why we think America has a national interest in how the conflict in Libya ends. First paragraph of the resolution we've introduced just now. Whereas peaceful demonstrations inspired by similar peaceful demonstrations in Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere in the Middle East began in Libya with calls for greater political reform, opportunity, justice, and the rule of law, and quickly spread to cities around the country. Second paragraph, whereas Muammar Gaddafi, his sons, and forces loyal to them responded to the peaceful demonstrations by authorizing and initiating violence against civilian non-combatants in Libya, including the use of air power, foreign mercenaries, helicopters, mortar and artillery fire, naval assets, snipers, and soldiers. Mr. President, I read those two paragraphs because they set exactly in context what's happening in Libya. The fact is that Libya is occurring in the context of these extraordinary, peaceful, democratic uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt that have been described, and I think correctly, as the Arab Spring. For too long, we accepted, I think, an argument that there were only two choices for the United States and most of the rest of the world in the Arab world. There was a choice between secular dictatorships that were cordial to us on one side and on the other side, radical Islamist regimes that despised us and were threatening to us. And we made our peace with those secular dictatorships, but it was inherently uncomfortable and inconsistent with our basic democratic values going back to the Declaration of Independence. And now, beginning in Tunisia and spreading to Egypt and then to Libya and other countries, the Arab people themselves rose up and said, no, there's a third way. And the third way is democracy. We want political freedom. We want economic opportunity. We want into the modern world. We don't want extremism of any kind. Those revolutions, those uprisings resulted in the end of the rule of two long-standing rulers, Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak in Egypt, and they happened peacefully for a lot of reasons. And part of it was that those two leaders did not order their militaries to turn on their own people, and the militaries, perhaps in those two cases, would not have done it in any case. So that's the Arab Spring. But now in Libya, because Gaddafi has taken exactly the opposite position and turned his guns and his military power on his own people as they peacefully demonstrated for change, for universal human rights, there's a danger that what's happening in Libya is essentially a wall being put up which says this peaceful democratic revolution in the Arab world ends here. To put it another way, that the Arab Spring may be going the way of the Prague Spring of 1968, when the people of then Czechoslovakia rose up and Soviet tanks and armaments suppressed their revolution. We simply cannot let that happen. Senator McCain and I were in Tunisia and Egypt a couple of weeks ago, and one of the messages that we got, particularly from the young people who have been at the head of this remarkable uprising in these two countries, was don't stand by. Please, America, don't stand by and let Gaddafi bludgeon his own people who are asking for the same rights and opportunity and freedoms that we have been asking for. Because if you do, it will end the movement of freedom and opportunity across the Arab world. And in some sense, the Tunisians and Egyptians said to us, it may set back our own cause, even though we have been successful thus far. And that's why it has been so frustrating, really infuriating, to watch as Gaddafi has moved with increasing brutality and force against his own people, pushing his opponents back, threatening really to totally suppress their uprising. And I have been struck as I've watched that the world community, most of it, is spending so much time discussing and debating. And as the world discusses and debates what to do in Libya, Libya descends back into Gaddafi's darkness. And we simply cannot let that happen. The Libyan people are not asking us to come in and fight for them. The Libyan people don't want our troops on the ground. And that's not what this resolution would authorize. The Libyan people want us to come to their aid in the sense of enabling them to fight Gaddafi's forces and Gaddafi, to carry on as freedom fighters. They want recognition as the established and legal authority, sovereignty for their country. They'd like some military assistance. They'd like weapons. They'd like the kind of intelligence and electronic assistance that we can give, and they'd like us in some way, a no-fly zone or using our capacity to fire missiles from offshore to protect them from what has turned the tide in their struggle for freedom against Gaddafi in Libya, which is the brutal use of Libyan air power against the Libyan people. If we don't do this, I fear that this Arab Spring will turn to winter, a winter of darkness and suppression again too quickly, and the world will regret it. People have said to Senator McCain and me, what's the American national interest in getting involved in Libya? And let me just give you a few reasons why I think we do have an interest. First, we have a clear national interest, a humanitarian interest in not standing idly by and watching tens of thousands of people slaughtered by their own government. As I've said, if we stand by and do nothing as this happens, it will be devastating to America's image in the Arab world and to our moral leadership throughout the world. Some people have argued, why would we want to get involved in yet a third Arab or Muslim country, thinking of Iraq and Afghanistan before that. But this is really more like 1990 and 91 and the first Gulf War, when the Arab world itself was calling out to us, please help us get Saddam out of Kuwait. The Arab world, as Senator McCain said, is pleading with us, help stop Gaddafi from slaughtering his own people, the blood of our brothers and sisters in Libya. Second, we have a clear national interest in preventing Libya from becoming a failed state that al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups will exploit, and that is precisely what will happen if this becomes a bloody and protracted civil war and then descends into chaos. Third, if Gaddafi is able to defeat this uprising, it will send a message, as Senator McCain has said, to every dictator in the world that the way to stop peaceful democratic protest is through brutal violence. Fourth, I don't mean this quote literally, but remember the old phrase from earlier times in history, if you go after the king, make sure you eliminate him, don't leave him wounded. If Gaddafi survives this, he is going to cause no end of trouble for the United States and anyone else in the world that stood with the freedom fighters. So let us not think that we can stand idly by and that we will not pay ourselves the consequences of Gaddafi surviving. And finally, there is a relationship between what's happening in Libya today and the instability it has caused throughout that region of the world and the skyrocketing price of gasoline at the pump that does concern the American people every day. In fact, with all that's been discussed, I think the best thing we could do to stabilize the price of gasoline in America is to stabilize Libya and to enable the Libyan opposition to Gaddafi to fight the fair fight that they want to fight. So that's the intention of this resolution. It's a, as the French would say, a cri de coeur. It's a cry from our hearts, because I fear that we've let so much time go by that it may be impossible to enable the freedom fighters in Libya to wage a fair fight. I hope their cause is not lost, because it is our cause, and the least we can do is help them fight for that cause against the man who has suppressed that cause in all his rule. I thank the chair, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I would ask my friend from Connecticut if we couldn't review a few of the facts as they are now. Despite the fact that the President made a statement that I am still bewildered by, I believe it was Saturday or Friday, the President said the noose is tightening around Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. I think the facts on the ground indicate that with superior firepower, ability to strike from the air, even if those strikes are not particularly effective, although apparently they're becoming more effective, and well-trained and well-equipped small forces, Colonel Gaddafi has been able to reverse the tide on the battlefield rather dramatically. All the news reports are that the military situation on the ground has shifted dramatically in favor of Gaddafi's forces, just as the General Clapper, our Director of National Intelligence, said on Thursday that Gaddafi is likely to win in the long term. And yet on the other side of the coin, the President of the United States has said that Gaddafi must go. So I guess my question to my colleague, my first one is, as the Wall Street Journal says, if Gaddafi survives after Mr. Obama has told him to go, the blow to U.S. prestige and world order would be enormous. Dictators will learn that the way to keep America from acting is to keep its diplomats and citizens around while mowing down your opponents as the world debates contingency. By the time the babblers make a decision, it will be too late. This is a dangerous message to send at any time, but especially with the Middle East in the throes of revolution. I would ask my colleague, American prestige is now on the line. The battlefield situation is, the tide is obviously against the pro-government and the pro-democracy forces. And wouldn't the message be sent to any dictator in the region of the world, rather than accept a situation such as happened in Egypt and Tunisia, send in the tanks, send in the military, slaughter people without consequence? Is that the lesson we would be sending here? I'd ask my friend from Connecticut.
I thank my friend and colleague from Arizona. I fear that that is exactly the message we would be sending if the United States and our allies stand back and let Gaddafi, through the force of his arms, suppress political dissent from his own people. I mean, one of the inspiring qualities to the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt was that they were peaceful. And incidentally, they were not anti-American. They were pro-Tunisia, pro-Egypt. They were the people of Tunisia and Egypt pleading for a better life. So the model there, and one of the most powerful examples of peaceful protest, which is really part of American history, was established. Now you've got, and it changed those two governments in Tunisia and Egypt. Now you've got another model being set here, which is when your people rise up and peacefully protest, you don't respond, you don't negotiate, you don't listen to them, you don't react, you turn your firepower on them, you kill them wantonly, and you keep doing that until that dissent ends. And one, that's in a world that's increasingly dangerous, that's a terrible message to send. Two, in a world in which, and let's just go back a little bit to what I said earlier about as we thought, and there were false choices in the Arab world. In Tunisia and Egypt, there has been expressed the strongest possible repudiation of al-Qaeda on the one hand and Iran on the other, both of whom, that is the government of Iran, both of whom have followed an Islamist extremist ideology and used violence to achieve their ends. So you've got the Tunisian-Egypt model of peaceful protest, democracy, economic opportunity, and now the other model, Gaddafi, violence. And what will it beget? It will beget more violence and will cost us dearly. I want to say to my friend from Arizona, as we say in our resolution, President Obama has made clear that he believes Gaddafi must go. And if after that clear statement of American policy by our Commander-in-Chief, Gaddafi does not go, and it is seen not just in the Arab world but throughout the wider world that the United States was not able to mobilize action in the world community to make sure Gaddafi went, but in fact he stayed, it inevitably has an effect on the credibility of American leadership in the world. And none of us want that to happen, including President Obama. So it's not too late, but the actions that we've taken, significant as they are, sanctions on Gaddafi and some people close to him, the threat or the plan to refer him and others close to him to the International Court of Criminal Justice, all important, but unfortunately, what is more important now is what's happening on the ground in Libya. And on the ground in Libya, the power of Gaddafi's forces are winning over the forces of freedom in a fight that is not fair.
I'd